My name is Ellie Patel, and at 34 years old, I am a major in the United States Army. It's a position I earned through relentless effort, a journey that began the night my brother, Jackson, punched me at his wedding rehearsal dinner 12 years ago. His fiancée, Diane, had called me trash. And instead of defending me, Jackson chose to believe her lies, screaming that I was no longer his sister. Yesterday, they showed up at my beachfront villa in San Diego, their old Ford looking like a refugee from a war of their own making. "We're moving in," they announced. I just smiled and pressed the button to lock the gate. Before I tell you how my brother went from punching me to begging at my door, leave a comment letting me know if you've ever had to stand your ground with family. The memory of that night is preserved in the cold, persistent drizzle of a Seattle evening. I remember the way the lights from the restaurant glittered across the dark surface of Lake Union, 1,000 shattered stars. Inside, the place was high-end, low lighting, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of expensive contentment. But all I could feel was the proud, perfect fit of my Army service uniform. The deep blue fabric of the jacket was immaculate, the brass on my buttons gleamed, and the white shirt beneath was starched to a military crispness. I was 22, a newly commissioned second lieutenant, and for the first time, I felt I was showing my family who I was truly meant to be. Tucked in my pocket was a letter of commendation from my commanding officer for finishing at the top of my training class. It was just paper, but to me, it was validation. It was proof that the sweat, the discipline, all of it had meant something. When I saw Jackson across the room, laughing with a groomsman, my heart swelled. I navigated through the tables to his side. "Hey, Jack," I said, my voice bright. "I wanted to show you something." He turned, his familiar grin wide. "Ellie, there's my little soldier. What have you got?" I pulled the folded letter from my pocket. "From my CO. I graduated with honors." Before he could take it, a hand with blood-red nails darted out and plucked it from my fingers. Diane. She slid next to Jackson, wrapping an arm around his waist, her smile a perfect curve that never reached her eyes. She scanned the letter, her expression unreadable. Then she looked up, tilting her head. "How cute," she said, her voice just loud enough for those nearby to hear. She handed the letter to Jackson as if it were a child's drawing. "It's like a little gold star for a good student." The air went out of me. The warmth I'd felt moments before was gone, replaced by a cold knot in my stomach. She had done it so skillfully, taken my proudest achievement, and with a few words, turned it into something trivial, something childish. Jackson, a few glasses of champagne in, just chuckled and clapped my shoulder, oblivious. "That's my sister," he slurred happily. "Always the overachiever." He didn't see the look in Diane's eyes, but I did. It was pure triumph. Later, I was trying to salvage the evening, talking to an aunt about the weather. That's when I saw Diane weaving her way through the crowd, a full glass of red wine in her hand, a predatory grace to her movements. I tried to ignore the alarm bells in my head. She tripped. One moment she was smiling, the next she was lurching forward with a theatrical gasp. The dark red Merlot arched through the air in a perfect, slow-motion trajectory, landing directly on the pristine white of my shirt. The cold shock of the liquid was immediate, seeping through to my skin. "Oh my God!" she shrieked, hands flying to her mouth. "Ellie, I am so sorry. I'm such a klutz." Amidst the flurry of napkins and insincere apologies, she leaned in close, her breath smelling of wine and a cloying perfume. "See?" she whispered, her voice a venomous hiss meant only for me. "You don't belong here." I excused myself and walked, not ran, to the restroom. My hands shook as I dabbed at the spreading stain with a wet paper towel. It was useless. A moment later, the door opened and Diane walked in, her victim act gone, replaced by a smug smirk. "Don't look so tragic," she said, checking her lipstick in the mirror. "It's just a shirt." "You did that on purpose," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. She turned from the mirror, her eyes hard. "Prove it." Just then, a silhouette appeared through the frosted glass of the door. Jackson. In an instant, Diane transformed. Her smug expression dissolved into terror. Her eyes welled with tears. Please don't, she sobbed, backing away from me. Please, Ellie, don't ruin my wedding. I said I was sorry. The door swung open. Jackson stood there, his face a thundercloud of confusion and anger. What the hell is going on? She's threatening me, Diane wailed, running to him. She said she was going to ruin everything because she hates me. It was a brilliant, despicable performance, and Jackson, my brother, my protector, bought every word. His eyes, clouded by alcohol and rage, landed on me. What did you do? He growled. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep, and hauled me out of the restroom. You've always been jealous, he shouted, his voice echoing through the now silent restaurant. People were staring. My aunt, my cousins, everyone. Jackson, you don't understand, I started, trying to pull my arm free. She's lying. He wasn't listening. His face was contorted in a mask of fury I'd never seen. And then he swung. It wasn't a slap, it was a punch. His fist connected with my cheekbone with a sickening thud. The physical pain was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the shock. The world tilted. The man who had taught me to ride a bike, my hero, had just hit me. I stumbled backward, landing hard on the cold tile floor. A collective gasp, then dead silence. I looked up to see Jackson standing over me, his chest heaving. Diane peeked from behind him, a flicker of victory in her tear-filled eyes. But the worst was yet to come. Jackson pointed a trembling finger at me. His voice, when it came, was no longer hot with anger. It was cold. As cold and dead as the space between stars. You're not my sister anymore, he said, each word a shard of ice. Get out. Don't you ever show your face to me again. Slowly, I pushed myself up. My cheek was already beginning to throb, a deep, pulsating ache. But I didn't cry. The wound was too deep for tears. I met his gaze, holding it for a long, silent moment, searing the image of his merciless face into my memory. Then, without a word, I turned and walked out, leaving the ruins of my family behind me in the suffocating silence. Hours later, I sat on a hard plastic chair at a deserted gate in the SeaTac airport, the midnight quiet broken only by the hum of a floor polisher. My flight back to base wasn't until 6 a.m. I stared down at the ugly dark stain on my once perfect uniform. It was more than spilled wine. It was a brand, a mark of betrayal. They had written me out of the family. Fine, I thought, a cold, hard resolve solidifying in the hollow space where my heart used to be. I would build an empire of my own. Before the empire, there was the kingdom. It wasn't a kingdom of beachfront villas and iron gates. It was a kingdom of damp Seattle afternoons, scraped knees, and the unshakable certainty that my older brother Jackson was the strongest man in the world. As I sat in that cold, sterile airport, the ghost of that kingdom was all I had left. Jackson was 4 years older, which, in the politics of our neighborhood, made him a king. He was the default captain of every street football game, the final word in every argument over rules. His reign was not one of tyranny, but of a firm, quiet justice that even the older kids respected. I remember when my beat-up sky-blue Schwinn bicycle was stolen by a neighborhood bully. I came home crying, my face streaked with dirt and tears. Jackson didn't fly into a rage. He just got a determined look in his eyes, walked out the door, and came back an hour later with my bike. What did you do? I asked, wide-eyed. Talk to his parents, he said simply, wiping a smudge of grease off the handlebar. Sometimes the biggest weapon isn't your fists, Ellie. It's knowing who's really in charge. He was 14. He taught me my first lesson in strategy, and I never forgot it. That sense of order he carried became our lifeline when our parents' marriage imploded. The divorce wasn't a clean break. It was a slow, messy unraveling that left our small house feeling chaotic and hollow. Our mother drifted through the rooms like a ghost, lost in her own grief. But Jackson, at 18, became an anchor. He was supposed to go away to college, having earned a partial scholarship to the University of Washington. He turned it down. He stayed, taking a job at a local auto shop, the smell of motor oil clinging to his clothes when he came home. He was the one who made sure there was always milk for cereal in the fridge, who'd sit with me at the kitchen table, patiently helping with my algebra homework. He was the calm in the storm, the steady hand when everything else was falling apart. Our sanctuary was the sloping roof of our little craftsman house. We'd climb out my bedroom window with 2 mugs of coffee from our old Mr. Coffee machine, always a little burnt tasting, but it was ours. We'd sit there for hours, watching the gray Seattle sky press down on the distant, jagged line of the Olympic Mountains. It was up there that we planned our future. Patel and Patel's security, he said one afternoon, the steam from his mug misting in the cool air. It's got a ring to it, don't you think? I'll be the business guy, you can be the field expert. We'll take over the world. It wasn't just a dream. It was a pact, a solemn promise made under a sky the color of slate. He made me feel like we were a team, that together we were invincible. I think, unconsciously, it was his example that led me to the military. The way he could command respect without raising his voice, the way he protected his own. I wanted to be that. I wanted to be him. So, when I decided to apply to West Point, I was terrified. It seemed like an impossible goal. Our aunt scoffed at the idea. "That's no place for a girl," she'd said, shaking her head. But Jackson was my fiercest advocate. He became my personal drill sergeant. He'd wake me up at 5 a.m. to run with him through the misty Seattle streets, pushing me when my lungs burned and my legs felt like lead. "Come on, Ellie, 1 more mile. You're stronger than you think," he'd shout, his voice full of a belief in me that I hadn't yet found in myself. The day the thick acceptance letter arrived, he was the first person I told. He lifted me off the ground, spinning me around in our living room, his laughter echoing off the walls. "I told you!" he yelled, his eyes shining with pride. "My sister is a warrior." One memory, more than any other, defines the Jackson I lost. I was 7, and our mom had taken us to Pike Place Market. It was a Saturday, crowded and overwhelming. The smell of fish, flowers, and damp pavement filled the air. I let go of her hand for just a second to look at a street performer, and when I turned back, she was gone, swallowed by the river of people. Panic, cold, and absolute seized me. I was a tiny island in a sea of strangers. My cries were lost in the noise of the market. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes before a familiar voice cut through the chaos. "Ellie!" It was Jackson. He pushed his way through the crowd, his face etched with worry. When he reached me, he didn't scold me. He just knelt down, scooped me up, and settled me on his shoulders. From up there, the world wasn't scary anymore. I could see over everyone's heads. He walked us straight to a small bakery, the one with the golden, crescent-shaped pastries in the window. He bought me a hot pierogi, filled with beef and cheese. The warmth of the pastry seeped into my cold hands, and the rich, savory taste was the most comforting thing I had ever known. He had found me, saved me, and made the world right again. That was my brother, the hero of my childhood, the man who could find a lost little girl in a crowd and make her feel safe. The contrast between that boy and the man who would one day strike that same girl's face is a canyon so deep, I still fear I will fall into it and never find my way out. He was my protector, my champion, my first and most loyal soldier. If you've ever had a person in your life who was your absolute hero, someone you looked up to more than anyone, please hit that like button. And in the comments, just write one word: hero. Let's see how many of us have a memory of a hero we hold on to. Looking back, sitting on that rooftop, I remember him wrapping an arm around my shoulders as the first drops of another Seattle rain began to fall. He pulled me in close. "Don't you worry, Ellie," he said, his voice full of the unwavering confidence I adored. "I'll always be your front line." And I believed him. I believed him with every fiber of my being. I had no idea that a front line could be breached, not by an enemy army, but by a woman with red nails and a perfect painted smile. Jackson's promise to be my front line had been the bedrock of my world. But a front line is only as strong as its weakest point, and that weakness arrived about 6 months after I'd started my first year at West Point. Her name was Diane. He met her at some corporate networking event in downtown Seattle. He called me, ecstatic, his voice buzzing with an energy I hadn't heard in years. "She's incredible, Ellie. Smart, beautiful. She just gets me." He was completely smitten, and I was happy for him. Truly. After everything he'd done for our family, he deserved to be happy. I met her for the first time that summer. I was home on leave, and my mom hosted a welcome home BBQ in the backyard. It was a classic American scene, the smell of charcoal and grilled hot dogs hanging in the air, the sound of kids laughing, the clink of cold beer bottles. When Diane arrived with Jackson, she was everything he'd described: polished, bubbly, and beautiful. With a smile that could charm anyone. She walked right up to me and pulled me into a hug that felt both enthusiastic and strangely hollow. "You must be Ellie," she gushed, holding me at arm's length. "Jackson talks about you constantly. I have so much admiration for what you do. It's so brave." At West Point, we received basic training in threat assessment and learning to read the subtle cues that signal a person's true intent. I wasn't an expert, but even I could see the disconnect between her warm words and her cool, appraising eyes. Her smile was a perfectly constructed facade. It never reached the rest of her face. A tiny red flag went up in my mind, but I pushed it down. I told myself I was being cynical, that the academy was making me paranoid. The first direct hit came later, as I was standing by the grill talking to an uncle. Diane came over, a plate of potato salad in her hand. She turned to me with that same bright smile. "So, West Point, huh? That's fascinating," she began, making it sound like she was discussing a strange hobby. "It must be a great way to get a free college degree, right?" The casualness of the remark was like a slap. My 4 years of relentless physical and mental conditioning, the commitment to serve my country, the immense pride I took in my uniform, all of it reduced to a clever financial calculation. It was designed to diminish me, to reframe my sacrifice as a shrewd angle. My uncle just grunted and took a bite of his burger, but I saw the flicker in Diane's eyes again. It was the same look she'd had in the restaurant, years later. The look of an expert marksman who had just hit her target. That was the beginning of her campaign of microaggressions, these tiny paper-cut insults that were so subtle, calling them out would make me seem like the crazy one. If I mentioned a grueling field exercise, she'd say something like, "Wow, that's admirable. But when do you plan on living a real life?" Or she'd sigh dramatically and say, "I just don't know how you stand having men yell at you all day. I prefer a man who treats me like a queen." Each comment was a carefully placed needle intended to frame my life as abnormal, unfeminine, and somehow less valuable than her own. Worse than the comments was her strategy of isolation. My weekly phone calls with Jackson, the ones that had been my lifeline through the toughest parts of my first year, started to become less frequent. He was always busy. There were always other plans. When I came home on a long weekend, excited to spend time with him, I was met with a practiced apology. "Oh, Ellie, you're here. That's great," Diane would say, her face a mask of regret. "I'm so sorry. Jackson and I just booked a last-minute weekend trip to Portland. We totally would have invited you, but it was so spontaneous." Jackson, blinded by love, saw nothing wrong. When I tried to gently voice my concerns, he'd get defensive. "You're just being overly sensitive, Ellie," he'd say. "She's trying her best to include you." But she wasn't. She was systematically cutting me out, severing the lines of communication between me and my most important ally. She was isolating her target, the breaking point. The moment the red flags in my mind started waving like a full-blown military parade, came the spring before they got engaged. I was home for a week and had been doing some research on investing. I had a small amount of my officer's salary saved up and wanted to be smart with it. I knew Jackson was a natural with business, so I approached him one evening while he was watching TV. "Hey, Jack, would you mind taking a look at these for me?" I asked, holding out a folder. "It's just some mutual fund options. I'd love to get your take." Before he could even respond, Diane's voice cut through the room from the kitchen. "Let's save that for another time, honey," she said, her tone light and breezy, but with an undercurrent of steel. "We need to focus on planning our future right now. Ellie's little hobbies can wait." Little hobbies, my financial future, my career. She dismissed it all as if it were a stamp collection. Jackson, to his credit, looked a little uncomfortable, but he didn't argue. He just gave me an apologetic shrug. Later that night, I found him alone in the kitchen. I took a deep breath. "Jackson, we need to talk." He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. "What's up?" "It's about Diane," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "The way she dismissed my request. The way she's always planning things when I'm home. Don't you see it? She's trying to put a wedge between us." His face hardened instantly. The openness was gone, replaced by a defensive wall. "Oh, here we go," he said, shaking his head. "I knew this was coming." "What are you talking about?" I asked, confused. "Diane warned me you'd be like this," he shot back, his voice rising. "Don't be jealous, Ellie. For the first time in my life, I have something that's just for me. Something that makes me happy. Don't you dare try to ruin it." The word jealous hit me like a physical blow. It was the masterstroke of her manipulation. She had preemptively framed any valid concern I might have as petty envy. I wasn't a sister trying to protect her brother. I was a jealous shrew trying to sabotage his happiness. That was the first time he chose her over me. He looked at me, his eyes cold. And I saw a stranger where my brother used to be. The front line had been breached, and I was standing on the wrong side of it, completely alone. After Jackson drew his line in the sand, I drew mine. It was a line that stretched across the entire country. The 12 years that followed were a silent, disciplined montage of becoming someone else. The girl who cried in Pike Place Market was gone. The sister who longed for her brother's approval was a ghost. In their place, I built a soldier. Pain is a powerful fuel. After that night at the rehearsal dinner, I poured all of it into my career. I stopped waiting for assignments. I volunteered for them. The toughest, the most remote, the ones nobody else wanted. That's how I ended up doing 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in the mountains of Afghanistan. The army stripped away what was left of my innocence, but it gave me something invaluable in return: purpose. Out there, under the relentless desert sun, family drama seemed like a distant, petty luxury. I learned to navigate by the stars, to read a topographical map in the dark, to command a patrol under the kind of extreme pressure that either breaks you or forges you into steel. I learned to make life or death decisions in a split second and then live with the consequences. The rules were clear, the objectives defined. There was no room for the gray, murky manipulations of Diane. There was only the mission. My new family was forged in that fire. They were the soldiers in my unit, the men and women who shared cold MREs, meals, ready to eat, with me in the back of a Humvee, who stood watch with me on sleepless nights in desolate forward operating bases. They were the ones who knew the sound of my voice under fire, and I knew theirs. Loyalty wasn't a word spoken at holidays. It was an action demonstrated every single day. It was trusting the person next to you with your life. I learned the hard way that blood doesn't make a family. Sacrifice does, trust does. I remember one firefight in a village in Kandahar province. We were taking heavy machine gun fire from a ridge, pinned down. A young private, a kid barely 19 from Ohio, started to panic. His breathing was ragged, his eyes wide with terror. He was going to freeze, or worse, he was going to run. My first instinct, the old angry Ellie, was to yell at him, to scream at him to get it together. But then, the image of Jackson, my protector, flashed in my mind. I crawled over to the private, the dirt and rocks scraping my knees. I put a hand firmly on his shoulder, forcing him to look at me. "Look at me," I said, my voice calm and low, cutting through the chaos. "Breathe with me, in, out. We are going to get through this, together." His eyes focused on mine. He nodded, his breathing steadied. He got back on his rifle. In that moment, I realized I had become the leader that Jackson had once been for me. I had become my own hero. But a soldier's armor can't protect from wounds that are carried inside. The professional success was a powerful anesthetic, but it couldn't erase the scar. The nightmares came. Sometimes they were of combat, but more often they were of that restaurant in Seattle. The sound of my brother's fist hitting my face. The cold, final words. You're not my sister anymore. I recognized the signs of a wound that wouldn't heal on its own. The Army, for all its flaws, had taught me that asking for help is a sign of strength, not weakness. I sought out the Army's mental health services. My weekly sessions with a therapist were tougher than any obstacle course. She helped me unpack the grief I had buried for so long. She gave me the language for my pain, betrayal, abandonment, loss. It wasn't just about the punch, it was about the death of the relationship I had cherished most. Therapy taught me how to rebuild my self-worth from the inside out and how to forge emotional boundaries as strong as any fortress wall. It was during this time that I met Army Chaplain David Miller. He was a kind, older man with eyes that had seen more than his share of war and loss. He never preached, he just listened. One day, I was telling him about my anger, about how unfair it was. He just nodded and said, "Ellie, we cannot choose the family we are born into. But we can build a family based on loyalty and sacrifice. Just look around you." And he was right. As I climbed the ranks, from lieutenant to captain, and finally to major, my empire began to take shape. It wasn't an empire of stocks and bonds. It was an empire of honor. It was the reputation I built as a fair, decisive, and unflinching officer. It was the respect I saw in the eyes of my superiors and the fierce loyalty of the soldiers under my command. These were my riches. The physical manifestation of that empire was a small modern house I bought in San Diego, overlooking the Pacific. I paid for it with my own salary, every dollar earned through discipline and sweat. It wasn't a mansion, but it was a sanctuary, a fortress of solitude built on a foundation of self-reliance. It was quiet, orderly, and safe. Everything my childhood home ceased to be. The 12 years passed in this manner, a silent, steady accumulation of rank, respect, and emotional distance. I didn't date seriously. I kept my circle small. I sent my mother a card on her birthday and at Christmas, always polite, always impersonal. I never asked about Jackson. I didn't want to know. My life was a well-run military operation, and he was a piece of painful, irrelevant history. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, an email landed in my inbox. I was sitting on my back patio, enjoying the California sun, a rare moment of peace. The sender was my mother. The subject line was a single, heavy word. Jackson. My finger hovered over the delete button. A decade of carefully constructed walls screamed at me to erase it, to pretend it never came. But my training took over. You never ignore intelligence, you assess it. I clicked it open. The email was short, stripped of my mother's usual rambling style. Ellie, I know we haven't spoken, but I didn't know who else to turn to. Jackson is in trouble. He lost his job months ago. They're losing their house. Diane is not handling it well. They have nowhere to go. I know it's too much to ask. But he's your brother. The words blurred on the screen. 12 years of silence, broken. The past, which I had successfully treated as a classified, sealed file, was suddenly, violently declassified. The ghost I had worked so hard to bury was standing at the gate. The hours after they left my gate were quiet. I didn't feel anger, not yet. I felt a cold, familiar clarity. The kind of clarity you get before a mission, when all the intelligence is on the table and it's time to formulate a plan of action. I let them stew in their uncertainty for 3 hours. Then, I picked up my phone and called Jackson. Patel, I answered, my voice flat and professional. Ellie, it's me. He sounded exhausted. I know, I said. Meet me at 1400 hours, Better Buzz Coffee, the one in Hillcrest. You will come alone. I used military time out of habit, but it also served a purpose. It established the framework for our interaction. This was not a family chat. This was a briefing. Okay, but Diane, he started. I cut him off, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. That was not a request. It was an instruction. 1400. Alone. I hung up before he could argue. In military strategy, the first step is to control the terrain. In this case, the terrain was the terms of engagement. By choosing a public, neutral location and isolating him from Diane, I was dividing their forces and setting the field of battle on my own terms. I arrived 15 minutes early, choosing a small table in the corner that gave me a clear view of the entrance. Better Buzz was busy, filled with the typical San Diego crowd. Students on laptops, friends catching up over iced lattes. The mundane normalcy of it all felt like a different universe from the one I was about to enter. Jackson shuffled in at 14:05, 5 minutes late. He looked older than 38. His shoulders were slumped, his face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He looked defeated. I was dressed in crisp civilian clothes, dark jeans, and a simple black blouse. I looked like a business executive. He looked like a man who had lost a war. He sat down without making eye contact. "Hey," he mumbled. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Situation report, Jackson. What happened?" He finally looked up, his eyes weary. He told me the whole story. It was a predictable tale of poor decisions and bad luck. He'd been laid off from his sales manager job 8 months ago. Too proud to tell anyone, he'd burned through their savings trying to find something comparable. Debt piled up. The house was foreclosed on. They had been living in a cheap motel for the last 2 weeks, and the money had finally run out. I listened without interruption, my expression neutral. I was an intelligence officer gathering intel, assessing the subject's weaknesses, motivations, and state of mind. He was desperate. That was his primary weakness. When he finished his story, a heavy silence fell between us. He looked at me, a flicker of the old entitlement in his eyes, as if expecting me to write a check and make it all go away. I leaned forward slightly, my voice low and even. "Thank you for that report. Now, let's conduct an after-action review of the last 12 years. He flinched. "Ellie, what?" "12 years, Jackson," I continued, cutting him off. 12 years with not a single phone call. Not one email while I was deployed in Iraq, wondering if I would make it home. Not a text message when Mom had her knee surgery. And most significantly, not one word of apology for punching me in the face and disowning me in front of our entire family. He looked down at his hands on the table. Guilt washed over his face, but it was a shallow, fleeting thing. I'm sorry, Ellie," he stammered. I shook my head slowly. "No, you're sorry because you're desperate. You're sorry because you showed up at my gate and I didn't welcome you with open arms. That isn't remorse, Jackson. That's just the logical consequence of your own actions." Just as the weight of my words seemed to finally land on him, a shadow fell over our table. I didn't even need to look up. I could smell her perfume. "What are you doing to him?" Diane's voice was sharp, accusatory. She had clearly followed him. "Are you interrogating him?" She tried to slide into the booth next to him, to re-establish their united front, but I held up a hand. "Stay standing," I commanded. It wasn't a shout, but the authority in my voice made her freeze. I looked at Jackson. "The debrief is over." Then I turned my gaze to both of them, my expression unyielding. They looked pathetic, a pair of drenched refugees caught in a storm of their own making. And then Diane, seeing she was losing control, played her last, desperate card. She rolled her eyes, a gesture of pure, dismissive arrogance. "Oh my God, are you still on about that? It was a million years ago. We were young, we all had too much to drink. It was a silly little argument. That's what adults do, Ellie. They move on." Silly little argument. The cold clarity inside me sharpened into a diamond-hard edge. All the pain, all the years of silent grief, coalesced into a single point of icy calm. I slowly stood up, my movements deliberate. I looked directly at Diane, then at my brother. "You want my help?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Fine, I will provide it. But not on your terms, not in the way you expect." I picked up my purse. "I am not giving you a home. I am giving you a chance. I will email you the terms of my assistance tonight. You will have 24 hours to accept or decline." I paused, letting the weight of the ultimatum sink in. I looked at my brother, the hero of my childhood, now just a weak, broken man. Then I looked at the woman who had orchestrated it all. "Dismissed," I said. And I turned and walked away, leaving them sitting in stunned silence in the middle of a bustling San Diego coffee shop. The war wasn't over, but the rules of engagement had just been rewritten. By me. That evening, I didn't pace my living room with anger or anxiety. I sat at the desk in my home office, the space clean and organized, and I began to draft my response. This wasn't a letter to my long-lost brother. This was an operations order, an OP or D. It was a clear, logical, and actionable plan designed to address a crisis. The objective was not reconciliation. The objective was to provide a structured solution while maintaining the integrity of my own hard-won peace. Before I started writing, I made one phone call. To Chaplain Miller. He was retired now, living in a quiet town in Arizona, but he still answered on the second ring. "Ellie Patel," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "To what do I owe the honor?" I explained the situation briefly, clinically. The arrival, the request, the confrontation. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "What does your heart tell you to do?" he finally asked. "My heart is compromised, Chaplain," I replied honestly. "It's not a reliable source of intelligence right now." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough. Then let me offer this piece of advice, Major. Act from your strength, not from your wound. Offer a solution that reflects the woman you are now, not the wounded girl you were then." His words settled me. He was right. The wounded girl would have either slammed the door forever or thrown it wide open and gotten hurt all over again. The woman I was now, Major Ellie Patel, would create a plan. I opened a new email document. The subject line was simple: Terms of Assistance. I structured it with clear, numbered headings, leaving no room for emotional interpretation. First, housing support. I wrote that I would pay the security deposit and first 3 months' rent for a modest 2-bedroom apartment. I specified the area: Chula Vista, a perfectly fine, affordable community south of San Diego. After 90 days, all rental responsibilities would be theirs. Crucially, I added, my name will not appear on the lease as a cosigner. This is temporary assistance, not a long-term subsidy. I was providing a runway, not a permanent hangar. Second, employment support. I stated that I would leverage my network of military veterans to connect Jackson with a professional career counselor. The terms were explicit. You will be required to provide me with a weekly report every Friday, detailing a minimum of 5 submitted job applications. Failure to do so will result in the immediate termination of housing support. This wasn't a handout, it was a hand up with strings attached. Strings of accountability. Third, and most important, mandatory counseling. This was the core of the entire operation. This was non-negotiable. You and Diane will be required to attend weekly family therapy sessions with a licensed counselor of my choosing, I typed. I will prepay for the first 6 sessions. A single unexcused absence will terminate this entire agreement. This wasn't about forcing them to apologize, it was about forcing them to confront the dysfunction that had led them to my doorstep. I wasn't interested in their words, I was interested in their willingness to do the work. Fourth, terms of engagement and personal boundaries. This section was for my own protection. During this probationary period, there will be no unannounced visits to my home. All communication will be scheduled via text or email. My personal space, my privacy, and my mental health are not negotiable. I was building a firewall. I would help them from a safe distance, but they would not be allowed to breach my perimeter again. I paused, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I thought about their kids, 2 children I had never met, who were innocent bystanders in their parents' self-made disaster, acting from my strength, not my wound. Chaplain Miller's voice echoed in my mind. I added a final point. Fifth, support for the children. I outlined that I would open and make an initial deposit into a 529 college savings plan for each of my nieces and/or nephews. This support was contingent on one thing: Jackson and Diane attending at least 3 sessions with a financial planner, also of my choosing. I was drawing a clear line in the sand. I would punish their irresponsibility, but I would not punish their children for it. I was investing in the next generation, not in their parents' mistakes. I read the entire document over one last time. It was cold, it was clinical, but it was fair. It was a solution. It offered them a path out of the darkness, but they would be required to walk it themselves. It was what a good officer would do. It was what a good person would do. It's a tough situation when you want to help family, but you also need to protect yourself. If you believe that setting strong boundaries is a form of love and not cruelty, hit the like button. In the comments, just write the word boundaries if you've ever had to build a wall to save yourself. With a steady hand, I clicked send. A strange sense of calm washed over me. I had taken control. I had turned their chaotic plea into a structured mission with clear parameters for success and failure. The ball was now in their court. I had done my part. The next 23 hours were the longest of my life. The silence was deafening. I went for a run. I did my work. I cleaned my already immaculate house. I did everything I could to not stare at my phone, but my eyes kept drifting back to it. I braced myself for a furious, entitled response from Diane. I expected a weak, pleading call from Jackson. I received nothing. As the 24-hour deadline approached, I had made peace with the idea that they would refuse, that their pride and dysfunction would be more powerful than their desperation. Maybe, I thought, that would be for the best. Then, with less than an hour to spare, my phone rang. It was Jackson's number. I let it ring twice before answering, keeping my voice level. Patel. There was a long pause on the other end, filled with the sound of a shaky breath. Then his voice, cracked and broken, a voice I hadn't heard in 12 years, came through the speaker. He choked out the word. We accept. The first mandatory therapy session felt less like a healing circle and more like a hostile negotiation. The therapist's office was designed to be soothing, with pale sage green walls, comfortable armchairs, and a box of tissues placed strategically on the coffee table. But the air inside was thick with 12 years of unspoken resentment. It was a demilitarized zone, and we were 3 opposing armies. I took my seat and adopted the posture of a formal military board review. Spine straight, hands resting on my knees, expression neutral. I remembered the advice of my old Army psychologist. You cannot control their reactions, Major, but you can control your engagement. Be a rock, solid, steady, and unmoved by their emotional tides. Today, I was granite. Jackson folded into his armchair, making himself as small as possible. He stared at the geometric pattern on the rug, avoiding eye contact with everyone. Diane, however, sat directly across from me, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her chin jutted out in a gesture of pure defiance. This was not a family reunion. This was a compulsory briefing, and she was a hostile attendee. The therapist, a calm, intelligent woman named Dr. Anya Sharma, began. Thank you all for coming. I'd like to start by having each of you share, from your own perspective, why you believe you're here today. Jackson mumbled something about past misunderstandings and wanting to move forward. His words were vague, weightless. Then Diane seized the stage. She uncrossed her arms and leaned forward, her face a carefully crafted mask of aggrieved sincerity. She launched into a polished, well-rehearsed narrative that painted her as the ultimate victim. I'm here because my husband is in a difficult position, she began, her voice trembling slightly. And because his sister. Well, there have been issues from the very beginning. I feel like I was never given a fair chance. She glanced at me, her eyes glistening with unshed crocodile tears. I came into Jackson's life, and I felt like I was being attacked by this person who was jealous, who couldn't accept that her brother was happy. She was this military person, almost brainwashed, and she tried to overshadow our wedding, the most important day of my life. The performance was breathtaking in its audacity. I felt a hot surge of rage, a familiar, metallic taste in the back of my throat. But I held my position. I remained a rock. I did not react. I simply observed. Thank you, Diane, Dr. Sharma said, her tone even. Ellie, would you like to share your perspective? It was my turn. I did not speak about my feelings. Feelings were subjective, debatable. I spoke about facts. I presented the events of that night like an after-action report. I am here because my assistance to my brother was contingent on this meeting, I stated, my voice clear and measured. The events that precipitated the 12-year gap in communication are as follows. Fact 1. At the rehearsal dinner, Diane referred to my military service and uniform as trash. Fact 2. Later that evening, Jackson physically assaulted me, striking my face and causing a significant contusion. Fact 3. I was then verbally disowned and banished from the wedding and from the family. These are the undisputed facts of the event. By stripping the emotion away and presenting a cold, factual timeline, I neutralized Diane's entire narrative. She could argue with my feelings, but she couldn't argue with the facts. The room fell silent. Diane's victim act faltered. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated hatred. Dr. Sharma turned her calm, steady gaze to my brother. Jackson, she said gently, do you agree with the facts as Ellie has just presented them? The air in the room became even heavier. Jackson squirmed in his seat. He shot a terrified, pleading look at Diane, who gave him a barely perceptible shake of her head. He was trapped between two powerful forces, and his weakness was palpable. He stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I don't really remember all the details. I'd been drinking. It was the classic evader's defense. Diane jumped in immediately, her voice sharp and protective. He was under a lot of stress, Anya. It was his wedding. Ellie was provoking. Dr. Sharma held up a single hand, a simple gesture that silenced Diane instantly. I'm not asking, Diane, she said, her voice still gentle but now with an edge of steel. She never broke eye contact with my brother. I'm asking you, Jackson, did you physically assault your sister? The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint sound of traffic outside. Jackson's face was pale, slick with a thin sheen of sweat. He looked from the therapist to his wife, and then, for the first time that day, his eyes met mine. In them, I saw a flicker of the boy from the rooftop, the hero from the market, buried deep beneath layers of shame and cowardice. He finally broke. He slumped forward, his head in his hands, and his shoulders began to shake. Yes, he finally admitted, his voice muffled by his hands. There was a push. I pushed her. A push. It was a lie, a downplaying of the truth. A pathetic attempt to minimize the violence, but it was also a crack. After 12 years of absolute denial, it was the first, tiny admission of wrongdoing. It was a single ray of light entering a sealed tomb. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't accountability, but it was a start. Dr. Sharma let the moment hang in the air before she spoke. Thank you for your honesty, Jackson. She then looked at all of us. We have a lot of work to do. For our next session, I want each of you to do some homework. She explained the assignment. We were each to write a letter to the person the other was 12 years ago. A letter to the young, hopeful Diane. A letter to the proud, young soldier Ellie. A letter to the happy, confident Jackson. We were not to send them. The letters were just for us, a way to confront the past we had all been carrying. As I walked out into the bright California sun, I felt no sense of victory, just a profound exhaustion and the faintest, most fragile flicker of something I hadn't felt in a very long time, a reason to continue the mission. Dr. Sharma's homework assignment felt like a tactical maneuver I hadn't anticipated. It forced us to turn our focus inward to confront the ghosts we'd each brought into that room. That week, the war wasn't between us. It was within us. On my balcony, overlooking the vast, steady blue of the Pacific Ocean, I sat with a pen and a legal pad. The anger from the first therapy session had dissipated, leaving behind a deep, profound sadness. I wasn't writing to the broken man from the coffee shop. I was writing to the boy on the rooftop, the hero of my childhood. To the Jackson of 12 years ago, I began. I wonder if you're still in there somewhere. I'm writing this because a therapist told me to, but I think a part of me needed to. I needed to talk to you, not the stranger who wears your face now. I remember you teaching me how to ride my bike, running behind me, your hand steady on the seat until you finally let go. I remember you finding me in Pike Place Market when I was 7 and thought I was lost forever. You put me on my shoulders and bought me a pierogi, and the world made sense again. When I got my acceptance letter to West Point, your pride was louder than anyone's doubts. You were my front line. That's why that night, it wasn't the punch that broke me, it was the fact that it was you. I'm not angry that you hit me anymore, Jackson. I'm angry that you forgot who we were. You forgot the pact we made on that roof, Patel and Patel security against the world. That night, you didn't just punch your sister. You killed the boy who was my hero. And I had to bury him all alone. I'm just afraid you'll never find your way back from his grave. I put the pen down, a single tear tracing a path down my cheek. It wasn't a letter of rage. It was a eulogy. I folded the paper and put it away, never intending for anyone else to see it. The following week, we were back in Dr. Sharma's office. The air was just as tense. Dr. Sharma started the session by asking us how the assignment had gone. Diane spoke first, her voice dripping with contempt. Honestly, I thought it was a pointless, childish exercise. We're adults. Rehashing the past doesn't pay the rent. But you did it? Dr. Sharma asked calmly. Jackson made me, she sniffed. And it was exactly what I thought. I wrote about how I felt attacked from day one, how I was just trying to protect my relationship from someone who clearly didn't approve. Dr. Sharma nodded, then gently prodded. What do you think was behind that feeling of being attacked? Diane scoffed. Isn't it obvious? She walked in with that uniform and that attitude, like she was better than everyone. He looked at her with this admiration. She had a purpose. She had his respect without even trying. She was the warrior, and I was just his girlfriend. Of course, I felt threatened. I sat there, a rock, just as I'd promised myself. But inside, something shifted. It wasn't an apology. It was a confession, buried under layers of blame. For the first time, I wasn't just hearing her hatred, I was seeing the source of it. Not that it excused anything, but for the first time, I understood. It was pure, pathetic insecurity. Then Dr. Sharma turned to Jackson. He looked even worse than the week before. He hadn't shaved, and his eyes were red-rimmed. He wouldn't look at anyone. Jackson, what was the experience like for you? He took a shaky breath. It was hard. I started to write one letter, trying to explain myself, blaming the stress, the champagne, all of it. He looked down at his hands. It felt like a lie, so I threw it out and started again. And what did the second letter say? Dr. Sharma asked. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine for a brief, painful second. The shame in them was an open wound. It said I was a coward, he said, his voice cracking. That I was scared. Scared of letting Diane down. Scared that I wasn't good enough. And because of that fear, I hurt the one person who had never given up on me. I broke you, Ellie. And there's no excuse for it. Not the alcohol, nothing. It was me. I did it. And I am sorry. Hearing those words, not mumbled in desperation at a coffee shop, but spoken with raw, agonizing honesty in that quiet room, it felt like the first clean air I'd breathed in 12 years. It didn't fix anything, but it was the truth. It wasn't until much, much later, months, maybe even a year down the line, after countless sessions had slowly chipped away at the mountain of denial, that he told me the rest of the story. He told me that after he wrote that letter, he couldn't stay in the apartment. He felt a crushing weight, a guilt he had spent a decade running from. He got in his car and just drove, with no destination. He told me how he ended up in a military surplus store near the naval base, surrounded by the symbols of the world he had once been so proud of me for joining. And he told me, his voice thick with a shame that was still fresh, that he bought a small lapel pin of the West Point crest. Duty, honor, country. He didn't have a plan for it, he just needed to hold something real, a tangible piece of the pride he had thrown away. He said he kept it in his pocket for weeks, the sharp edges a constant secret reminder of his failure. He hadn't told me this to earn forgiveness. He told me as a simple statement of fact, a part of the story I was missing. That secret act of penance, that small, lonely gesture. It didn't erase the past. But it was the first time I believed that the man I knew, the hero from my childhood, might not be buried as deep as I had thought. A confession in a therapist's office is one thing. Words spoken in a controlled environment are like battle plans drawn on a map. They have yet to meet the unpredictable terrain of the real world. The real test came a few weeks later. Dr. Sharma, in her infinite wisdom, suggested our next step should be a meeting in a neutral, public space, one that included the children. My first instinct was to refuse. My boundaries were clear. No personal contact outside of therapy. But then I remembered my own principle, a lesson I'd learned while trying to build trust with tribal elders in Afghanistan. Start with small gestures of respect. Let them see your intent through your actions, not just your words. My actions so far had been about establishing control. Perhaps it was time for a different kind of action. I agreed. We decided on Balboa Park on a Sunday afternoon. I arrived early, a soldier's habit of surveying the terrain. I chose a park bench near the botanical garden, a spot that gave me a wide, clear view of the main walkway. The park was alive with the sounds of a perfect San Diego day. Families picnicking on the grass, the distant music of a Spanish guitarist, the laughter of children chasing pigeons. It was a world away from the tense silence of Dr. Sharma's office. When I saw them approaching, my guard went up instantly. Jackson looked nervous, Diane looked wary, and they were holding the hands of two small children. A boy and a girl. My nephew and niece, the ones I had only ever known as names in a college savings plan. They were the buffer zone, the innocent civilians in our emotional minefield. The boy, who I learned was 9-year-old Leo, was shy and hid behind Jackson's leg. But the girl, 7-year-old Leah, was fearless. She had bright, curious eyes and a head of unruly curls. She marched right up to me, looked me up and down, and asked, "Are you a real soldier? Mom said you were a soldier." I felt a genuine smile crack through my stony facade. "Yes, I am," I said, my voice softer than I intended. Leo, emboldened by his sister, peeked out. "Then why don't you ever come to our house?" The simple, honest question landed in the space between us with the force of a grenade. The air thickened. Jackson and Diane froze, their faces a mixture of shame and panic. They had no answer. I looked at Leo, then at Leah, and gave them a version of the truth that they could understand. "Because sometimes," I said gently, "grown-ups need some time to learn how to be friends again." It was the best I could do. It was honest without being damaging, and it seemed to satisfy their curiosity. We started to walk, a strange, awkward procession through the park. We made small talk. The weather, the flowers. Diane was unusually quiet. Jackson kept clearing his throat. The kids were the only ones who were natural, chasing each other, pointing out dogs, and asking me a million questions about being a soldier. Then, it happened. Leah, running ahead on the sidewalk, tripped over an uneven patch of pavement and went down hard. Her cry was sharp and immediate. The reactions were telling. Diane gasped and rushed forward with a flustered, "Oh, sweetie, are you okay?" Jackson hovered, looking helpless and unsure of what to do. But my training took over. I was already moving, my mind clear and focused. I knelt beside Leah on the concrete. "Let me see, soldier," I said, my voice calm and reassuring. Her knee was scraped and bleeding, but it wasn't serious. "Don't worry, this is a minor wound. We can fix this." I always carry a small IFOC, an individual first aid kit, in my purse. It's another habit that's impossible to break. I pulled out an antiseptic wipe and cleaned the scrape, my movements efficient and gentle. Leah, who had been on the verge of a full-blown wail, quieted down, watching me with wide, teary eyes. "This might sting for a second, but it'll get the bad guys out," I told her, and she nodded bravely. I dried the area and pulled out the secret weapon I kept in the kit for just such an occasion, a Band-Aid with a unicorn on it. "There," I said, smoothing it over her knee. "All patched up." She looked at her knee, then at me. and threw her little arms around my neck in a fierce, sudden hug. "Thank you, Aunt Ellie," she whispered. Over her shoulder, I saw Jackson and Diane. Diane's face held a complex expression I'd never seen before. The hard mask of jealousy was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. And Jackson just looked profoundly sad. I could almost hear his thoughts. He was remembering a little girl with a scraped knee that he used to take care of, and realizing, with gut-punching clarity, how the roles had completely reversed. He had missed 12 years of watching that little girl become this woman. The walk back to the parking lot was quieter, but it was a different kind of quiet, not as tense. As we neared their car, Leo, who had been thinking, turned to his dad. "Dad," he asked, his voice serious, "why do grown-ups need to learn to be friends again? Did you and Aunt Ellie have a fight?" This was it, the moment of truth. Jackson could have brushed it off, given a vague non-answer. But he didn't. He stopped walking. He took a deep breath and looked down at his son. Then his eyes met mine. He spoke to Leo, but his words were meant for me. "It wasn't a fight, buddy," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. Dad was wrong. A long, long time ago, I was very unfair to your Aunt Ellie, and I'm trying really hard now to see if she can forgive me." It was a public surrender, an honorable admission of fault, spoken in front of the next generation. It was the apology I had waited 12 years to hear, not because he needed something from me, but because it was the truth. It was the first, solid, foundational stone laid down in the long, slow process of rebuilding a bridge I thought had been burned to ashes. Jackson's admission in front of his son wasn't a finish line. It was the starting pistol for the real, grueling marathon of rebuilding. The year that followed was a slow, deliberate process of laying one stone at a time, of testing the ground before taking the next step. It was a year of establishing a new order. Jackson, with a reference from one of my veteran contacts, landed a steady job in logistics. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and he attacked it with a humility I had never seen in him. Diane, swallowing her pride, took a part-time retail job at a department store. They stayed in the small apartment in Chula Vista, but after the first 3 months, they started paying the rent themselves. Every Friday, without fail, I received a simple, factual email from Jackson detailing his work progress and confirming their therapy appointments had been kept. The meetings in Dr. Sharma's office continued. The tension slowly eased, replaced by a kind of awkward, fragile honesty. The visits with the kids became more regular, supervised patrols at parks, the zoo, the beach. My boundaries, the firewall I had built around my life, remained absolute. They were respected without question. There were no surprise visits, no desperate phone calls. There was just a quiet, consistent effort. About 10 months in, I received a text from a number I didn't recognize. "It's Diane. Could we meet for coffee? Just us." My first instinct was to say no. But my second, the voice of the woman I had become, was one of curiosity. We met at a neutral coffee shop, the same one where I had issued my ultimatum. This time, the dynamic was completely different. There were no theatrics, no tears. She just looked at me, her eyes clear of the old defenses. "I owe you an apology," she said, her voice steady. "A real one. I was so jealous of you, Ellie. You were everything I wasn't. You were strong, you had this incredible purpose, and he looked at you with this hero worship in his eyes. I felt like I had to fight for my own space in his life. I was wrong. The way I treated you was inexcusable, and I am truly, deeply sorry." It was a confession so direct and sincere it left me momentarily speechless. It didn't magically erase 12 years of pain, but it did something almost as powerful. It opened a door, not to the past, but to a different kind of future. That's why, when Thanksgiving rolled around, I did something I never thought I would do. I decided to host it at my home. I invited my chosen family, Chaplain Miller, who flew in from Arizona, and a few of my closest friends from the service. And I invited Jackson, Diane, Leo, and Leah. I watched their old Ford pull up to my house, the same car that had looked so pathetic and desperate nearly a year ago. It still looked old, but now it just looked like a family car. I saw Leah's face pressed against the window, her eyes wide with excitement. As they got out and walked towards the gate, a memory of me standing in that same spot, my finger on the lock button, flashed in my mind. But this time, I didn't wait for them to ring the bell. I walked down the path and pulled the heavy iron gate open myself. The afternoon was a surreal and beautiful blend of my two worlds. My tough-as-nails army buddies were on the lawn, letting my 7-year-old niece paint their faces with glitter. Chaplain Miller, a man who had counseled soldiers through the horrors of war, was in the kitchen, engaged in a very serious debate with Jackson over the merits of basting versus brining a turkey. The smell of roasting poultry and pumpkin pie filled the house. Under the warm California sun, in the sanctuary I'd built for myself, my family of choice and my family of birth were, for the first time, simply family. Later, after the meal, when the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jackson found me on the balcony, looking out at the ocean. We stood in a comfortable silence for a few moments. "Thank you, Ellie," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, "for not giving up on me, even when I deserved it." I shook my head, turning to look at him. In the fading light, I could see the new lines on his face, the gray in his hair. The ghost of the angry man in the restaurant was gone. "I didn't do it for you, Jackson," I said softly. "I did it for me. I couldn't let what you did define the rest of my life. I had to find a way to make peace with it, or it would have owned me forever." He nodded, understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. He placed it in my hand. It was the West Point lapel pin, small, heavy, and real. "I think this belongs to you," he said simply. Just then, Diane walked out onto the balcony with 2 plates of pie. She handed one to me, and her eyes met mine. There was no jealousy there anymore, just a quiet gratitude. "Thank you, Ellie," she said, "for not throwing us away." Her simple words, like Jackson's gift, held more weight than 1,000 flowery apologies. I looked from the pin in my hand to my brother's face. I didn't see the monster from my nightmares. I saw a man who had gotten lost and was, against all odds, finding his way home. Our relationship would never be the innocent, hero-worshipping bond of our childhood. It couldn't be. But it was something new, something forged in the fires of a painful truth, built on a foundation of hard-won respect and carefully maintained boundaries. And maybe, just maybe, that was something stronger. Chaplain Miller once told me, quoting a verse I've never forgotten, "Blessed are the peacemakers." For 12 years, I trained to be a warrior. But the longest, hardest battle I ever fought wasn't in some foreign desert. It was right here. And the greatest victory wasn't in defeating an enemy. It was in finally, after all this time, making peace with myself. My journey to the peace I feel on this balcony today was the longest, hardest mission of my life. I know many of you listening have fought your own battles, not in deserts or mountains, but in living rooms and over holiday dinners. If this story of finding strength by building boundaries resonated with you, I invite you to become part of our community. Please subscribe to the Chosen Revenge channel and press the like button on this story. We share these journeys to remind one another that we are not alone. Your support helps us continue that mission. Thank you for listening.